And I feel like after the three great presentations we've had, I feel like I have to throw my planned presentation out the door and ad lib, because part of it you already have heard, part of it is what I might disagree with. And I will say that mostly what I disagree with revolves around what you call things. So I don't disagree in substance with the three presentations we've heard so far today. What I might disagree with is what you call, whether it's intelligence or not intelligence. It's and so I'm gonna take a chance now and change my presentation to adapt to that, because if cybersecurity is, if nothing else, necessarily adaptive. Segue, good one. So here are my conclusions. Thank you very much. I think we've had too much emphasis on the boundaries of our networks, and instead we have to look inward. We have to defend the interior, and I call that computational T cells. I'll explain that as we go on. The attackers are using artificial intelligence the way I mean it. They are using machine learning, they're using rules, they're using all the kinds of things that solve specific problems. And that allows them to behave in ways that are cheaper, better, faster than they could without it. So we need to use the same kinds of tools that are cheaper, better, faster, and more powerful than just having people by themselves. We have to change our emphasis on what we're looking for. We have to go after the essential properties of the attacks, and I call those computational antigens. The T cells attack the antigens. The T cells have antibodies that attack the antigens. And we have to look for the spoor of attacks. We have to not just look for the attack. We have to look for the results of the attack. And we have to look for the absence of typical information. Chase talked a bit about that. What's normal, and do we find things that are supposed to be there that aren't there? These are things that we at least underemphasize, if not underappreciate. So you all know that we've been attacked increasingly over the past few months, and they've had huge social effects, and I don't need to dwell on these things, but they paid a ransom. It's a huge problem, and we got to do something about it. The attack on Colonial Pipeline, I think, pushed forward the release of an executive order on improving cybersecurity. Again, telling us that we've got to pay attention to the stuff that we know we have to pay attention to. And this is just some of the headlines that have been coming out. And I thought I was done with this slide, and I kept having to add stuff to it. More and more and more of these things. I suspect that they will be a little bit less prevalent over the next few months, but I don't know. They certainly constitute an epidemic of cyber threats. And as one of our friends said recently, it's a signal that we have to act. We've got to do something about it. So you know how they get in. It's largely this guy's fault. He's the one who lets them in. He opens the door and says, "Come on in." We talked about in one of our breakouts this morning about how phishing is responsible for opening the door some maybe 90% of the time. It's this guy's fault. There are other ways they get in. Water hole attacks are pretty common, and we'll come back to that in a minute. There are removable media. Stuxnet apparently was distributed on removable media. You can add hardware. People you trust can be corrupted, either unknowingly or sometimes knowingly. Supply chain compromises, we know about those as well. but the main way they get in is by Phoebe letting them in, disguised as the human error guy before. So one way, and I'm going through this part quickly because I want to spend more time than I planned talking about artificial intelligence and machine learning. So one approach is to set up a lure, and the lure can be an email, or it can be a watering hole attack. A watering hole attack is where you set up a website, you corrupt it, and when victims come to that website, their computers get corrupted. So you can get them that way. And in fact, that's what happened in Oldsmar, Florida, what Sam was talking about. The hacker got in using a desktop application that would allow people to remote desktop in and increase the concentration of lye from 100 parts per million, because they wanted a certain level of alkalinity, to 11,100 parts per million. Apparently they first got in because the people at the water plant in Oldsmar on Tampa Bay attached to a website with 1,000 other computers that are all potentially infected. And that's apparently how the hacker got in. So I think that what we have to have is predictive threat hunting. We have to look forward to things that we don't already know about. And we have to figure out a way that we can identify those things that we don't already know about based on the things that we do know. So we have to take what we've known. We have to do retrospective analysis. Whenever there's a cyber breach, they bring in the forensic guys who do an investigation and figure out, oh, this is where they got in. This is what they did. This is how we know. And my question basically is, if you know all that, why don't you apply that prospectively? If you know, if you can reconstruct it retrospectively, why can't you use that information to predict where things are going to be, to predict? And the other part of that is, once you have an advanced persistent threat, somebody who's gotten in and hidden in your network and has attacked you, it often takes 6 to 9 months to recognize that you've even been attacked. If we could do nothing else but reduce that to 1 month, we would have tremendous value out of the process. So 0-day exploits. These are cyber attacks where the vulnerability is not known, at least it's not known to the victim. And so they get in, the attacker, of course, knows about the vulnerability. And there's a whole research industry on finding these vulnerabilities. And sometimes the companies with vulnerable software paid to identify them. Sometimes the attackers just hide them, but they can be very common. And in fact, here's an analysis from some malware hunters at Google. They found that these attackers use 11 of these, and they're hard to find, but they're out there. 11 0 days to infect Windows and iOS and Android. And the thing about 0 days is we don't have a way of identifying the item in which the 0 day comes in. And I'll explain that in just a second. We tend to use what's called signature-based detection. That is, I've seen that one before. And it might be the mathematical representation of a file, so that we get a new file, we compute what's called the signature, and with a hash, and we say, oh, I've seen that file before. But if the attackers are the least bit smart, they change the file a little bit. That changes the signature, and so we don't know that we've seen that file before. But we may use what's called a fuzzy signature, a fuzzy hash, and so similar files might be recognized. But again, we have to have seen it in order to be able to recognize it, or at least seen something that's very similar. When you see an item with a signature, you say, there's got to be a needle in that haystack somewhere. I know that haystack. I recognize that one. The dark side, which is what infected Colonial Pipeline, the dark side group, they defeated the signature-based detection because they managed to modify their malware for each individual attack. So they changed the command and controls. That's what C2S is here. They changed other features of it. But what they couldn't change is what makes it malware. That stuff can be concealed, but it has to be there in some way. And we ought to be able to find it. But if it's a 0 day, we don't have a signature for it. So what we need is to hunt for the threats. We need to actually look for the needles, not the haystacks. And the needles are what can poke us. The needles are what cause the damage. So here's an example. And by needles, I also call them computational antigens. They are essential features. For example, in this case, it's an encoded string, a bash command. We can look at traffic on the network. And in this case, here's an echo command that's embedded in the code. Echo means computer, run this as if I were typing it. And so we echo this string here of characters into a base 64 decoder, which translates these characters into other characters. And then we say, go run that. Bash is the control command for Linux or Unix. And so it also works on Macs. So we get, and it turns into this command, which is go download some software from someplace else. Now, if we can identify these features, like it has the bash command in it, it has encoded strings in it, then we ought to be able to identify the actual malware based on the features of the malware, not based on the container that it comes in. So we need to engage in a retrospective analysis in order to identify what those features are in order to be able to look for them in the future. So how do they do it? What weaknesses, et cetera? We have to dig in order to find it. But if we can dig it, we can look for it before we are attacked, not necessarily afterwards. So why do we need artificial intelligence in this? And let me say what I mean by artificial intelligence. There's general artificial intelligence or artificial general intelligence. And then there's what we have today, which is specific artificial intelligence. It deals with just specific tasks, playing chess, detecting malware. It's not generally intelligent. You can't just throw something at it and expect it to work. Both Chase and Petter are right that there's a lot of hype, that a lot of vendors say, hey, look, just put our system on your system, and we will take care of you, and everything will be perfect. We can solve all your problems. Just not true. So to quote from Chase, BS. And then that part he's absolutely right. It's much more specific than that. A computer that learns to play chess, what it learns playing chess cannot be transferred to learn to play Go. Some of the parts of it can. There's a group now they're part of Google that looks at transferring from one task to another, but it's because they use different tasks that all have the same parts, and the system learns the parts, like controlling mouse movements on a screen, and that's what's common among them, and that's what transfers. So why do we need artificial intelligence in the way I mean it? We need it because we don't have enough people. We cannot hire enough people. The people can't work fast enough. They can't deal with the variety of things that are going on because it often requires complex relations among things. There's too much velocity, variety, and volume. So for that, we need automation, adaptability, algorithms, and adversarial learning. We have to help leverage the intelligence of the people so that they aren't dependent on just themselves. Power tools. We need power tools to amplify the intelligence of our cybersecurity analysts. And that's what artificial intelligence gives them. That's what machine learning, which is one of the kinds of artificial intelligence, gives them. It's not going to make them instantly brilliant. It's not going to let them take over the world. It's not going to suddenly become sentient and conscious, but it is going to help solve our cybersecurity issues. And this is where I want to spend more time than I had planned, because I think we're talking about more of these things than I thought we would be talking about. The cybersecurity attackers are, as Gary says, horizontally organized. They share things. They talk to one another. You can actually hire dark side to do your cyber attacks, and they will share in the booty. So how do we use that to our advantage? Well, one way is through adversarial learning. This is essentially an automated red team, blue team kind of approach, where we have two computational models. One model generates attacks, and the other model identifies the attacks. And the attack generator tries to fool the attack identifier, and the attack identifier tries to not be fooled by the attack generator. Sometimes you've heard reinforcement learning mentioned. If there is a series of steps, and the problem is to learn that series of steps, sometimes reinforcement learning can be used. Reinforcement learning says, you go through a series of steps, I'll tell you whether you got it right or wrong. And then you can use that to decide which of those, how to allocate those steps and what order to execute them in. That's reinforcement learning. You've heard supervised learning. Supervised learning is try something, you get feedback. Try something, you get feedback. And humans usually have to label the feedback. But in adversarial learning, the feedback can be the identification, whether it's successful or not, of the identifying system. When AlphaGo learned to play Go, the computer system at Google that beat some of the best Go players in the world, it learned by playing against itself. So it was both the generator of the attack and the identifier of the attack. And slight variations in the programs allowed both programs to get better, competing with one another. We can do the same kind of thing with artificial intelligence, the way I mean it, and with adversarial learning. So that it doesn't require huge amounts of outside data. The generative model generates the attacks, and the discriminative model identifies the attacks. These approaches are dependent on where you start, what tools you give the generator, what kinds of things that the generator can generate. That makes a huge difference. And what kinds of features the identifier looks for. We have machine learning systems that claim to be able to identify features, but really what they're identifying is some mathematical formulation of the features that you give it. And that works kind of okay with image analysis, but Chase showed that one of the panda being mistaken as a gibbon. And that is in large part because the system uses low frequency information to make its distinction. People use low frequency and the computer uses high frequency, where high frequency is the little dots that he showed in the middle there. And low frequency is if you kind of squint your eyes, what do you see when you look at the picture? So here's an example of that, of adversarial learning. There's a mutator engine that changes the inputs a little bit. And then there's a detector engine that detects whether it's an attack or not. And then it uses back propagation. That's the supervised learning. But it provides its own supervision. The detector provides a supervision for the mutator, and the mutator provides a supervision for the detector, and thereby they both get better. I have done some of this. I did it with identifying the URLs for malware. And one of the features that it turns out is that malware tends to use random looking URLs. And it must, because so many of the domain names are already registered. In fact, my mutator engine would generate a domain name. I'd look it up, and about half the random domain names I generated were already registered. So I can't use them as a command and control unless I can somehow acquire them. So it has to use domain generation methods, and exactly what methods you give your mutator determine what kinds of things you can discover with this. Here's another example, a little bit more complicated. And in this case, what they were looking at is the pattern of API calls in a Windows program. So Windows has all of these functions that a program can use so that the developer doesn't have to write his own stuff or her own stuff. Rather, they just call a capability, a function in Windows, and Windows lets you use their pre-written functions. And so if you detect a pattern of system calls, you can get about, well, in a simple version of this, you can get about 85% accurate in detecting malware. But with adversarial learning, you start with that and you get even better. So I hope I've gotten some across on artificial intelligence and machine learning and their role in cybersecurity. Next, I want to talk about where to look, how to do it. The two adversarial programs I just talked about all were, how do I detect malware when it comes into my system? So in COVID-19 parlance, how do I wear a better mask? But even if you wear a good mask, even if you practice good hygiene, even if you keep your distance, that may not be enough. You still have to get vaccinated, because the infections get in one way or another. It's not a matter of will the attackers get in, it's when. And once they get in, they tend to hide. The ransomware doesn't work instantly. There's a process that goes on over time to encrypt the data. We can detect that. And these days, with everybody working from home and so on, there's no clear definable boundary. So this is what we need to do. We have to have labeled cybersecurity. And some people do this, but I don't think we do this anywhere near enough. The more I dig into this, the more I find that, yeah, there's parts of this that are out there, but we need to do more. So we're good at blocking the boundary. It used to be thought that if all you do is, if you completely disconnect your system from the internet, you'll be safe. I think that that's not true. And I showed some of the other ways in which it's not true, that the attackers still get in. But if you're a business that depends on the internet, you can't block everything because you've got your normal traffic You've got your business you have to do. If you want to be safe, go hide in a cave somewhere, but then you're out of business. So you can repel the attacks that you can repel, but some of them are going to get in. And once they get in, you need tools that I call computational T cells that will help to identify and neutralize those threats. So a biological T cell starts off in your bone marrow. The cells migrate to the thymus where they learn what's normal. This is critical. The T cells have the ability to attack your own body cells. But if they did, you get an autoimmune disease, you get all kinds of problems like rheumatoid arthritis and lupus and stuff. And that's when it goes wrong. When it goes right, it learns to avoid your own cells. And then after it learns what's normal, then it gets circulated to attack potential intruders. So computational T cells, we start with an historic analysis. We learn what's normal, and we target necessary properties. The thing has come up about, oh, you need so much data for machine learning. Well, you don't often need so much data. And the second problem is, we have exactly the opposite problem in cybersecurity. We don't have, it's not that we don't have enough data, we have too much data. There's too many things going on. We have billions of transactions a day going through our systems. And we need machine learning to monitor them, to be able to deal with them. But the problem is to filter out what's important. And if you do it naively, you'll end up deciding that the attack that occurred 6 months ago is normal and let it just go on. But you got to start someplace, and you got to not be relying on the machine alone to give you a result. So you have to look at what's normal. You have to look at what external contacts are being made, what lateral movements. Malware tends to move around your network. You have to look for unusual devices that are on the system, unusual activity. Mainly you have to look for anomalies. These are an example of, that I stole of some of the things we can look for. And the way T cells work, here's a cartoon. The antigen is the thing that is causing, that could cause a problem. The antibody is the property of the T cell. There's a match between antibodies and antigens. And once a T cell traps because it matches the antibody, the epitope on the antibody, then it kills that cell and or the virus or whatever it is. And that's how vaccines work. They stimulate the production of the antibodies on the T cells, and we can use those instead to look for indicators of compromise. So we need artificial intelligence because we want to do more than merely identify the known threats. We need pattern matching. And the patterns that we have to match are often complex. We start, when we build artificial intelligence systems, we start with simple problems because we are simple people. And we get a minimum viable product. But after that, we have to get more sophisticated, more powerful, and more accurate. And that's why we say, oh, these things have problems. They have problems because we're starting. We're not finished. We have to look for the absence of information. Sometimes instead of looking for the attack directly, we have to look for, did the attacker shut off information? We have to mind the gaps. We have to not rely on accidents. So again, that water supply system that was attacked, the plant operators watched as the hackers took control of the mouse. If they hadn't been sitting there, they would not have known. We can't rely on accidents to be the source of cybersecurity. They got lucky. How often can we trust in luck? we have to look for things that are evidence of it, like unnecessary obfuscation. If suddenly some log starts including encoded strings rather than the clear language it used to encode, that could mean that something's going on that you're not supposed to know about. So what we need is artificial intelligence to allow an automated route to context-dependent use of past information to find future threats. And the National Security Commission, Michael can vouch for this, said that defending against AI-capable adversaries without employing AI is an invitation to disaster, and I think that that's right. So again, the conclusions: guard the border, defend the interior, use AI, identify the essential properties, look for traces of attack, not just the cause of the attack, and look for anomalies, both of presence and of absence. And this is me. And there's a T cell.